Hey everyone, we are going through this book study, The Third Option, and I am really excited to talk to you all today. This is a really important study, and throughout this study, hopefully you're beginning to learn some action steps and figuring out ways that you can be engaging in relationships with other people. And sometimes this can be confusing. We don't really know where to begin. We might be too afraid of offending other people, and so I just want to put us at ease. For us, these kinds of relationships, it's ministry. And ministry isn't rocket science. Jesus talks about this really clearly in Matthew 22. It's the golden rule. It's the most important commandments, right? We're called to love God with everything we've got. And we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so if we're doing these things, then there's nothing that we really need to worry about. Our intentions are pure, and so we don't need to be anxious about engaging with other people in these kinds of conversations. And so, as we continue moving forward, we might feel a little bit of discomfort, but don't be afraid of that. I think this is a good thing. You see, we all have prejudice. We all have biases, and they might be implicit or explicit, but they're things that are caught or taught throughout our lives. I have a friend and mentor. His name is Michael Megason, and something that he says is that it's hard to hate someone that you know. He talks about if there's someone that is like irritating him, he's like, I'm going to go get to know that person, because it's going to be a lot harder to be angry with them if I actually have a relationship with them. We all have prejudices and prejudgments about other people, and Christians, we're not judgy, right? I actually think we really struggle with that. And so I think it's really important for us to begin to start working on those kinds of things. Pastor Danny up at Hope Ames, I heard a sermon of his a few months ago where he talked about calling out his own biases so that they don't become his idols. I think that's so important for us. There are things that can hold power over us if we allow it to, but we are called to live in other ways and interact with the world around us in different ways than allowing them to have the power. We identify them, we work through them, and we don't allow bitterness to creep into our hearts. In our prejudgments, we are making assumptions about other people. A little bit about my story. I'm adopted from South Korea. I was raised in Iowa from the time I was a baby up until I graduated high school. I went down south and I studied. I went to college in Kentucky. I went to seminary in Tennessee. And I ran from my ethnic identity for a majority of those life experiences that I just told you about. You see, for me growing up, I was in a very white community, and I didn't want to be seen as other. I didn't want to be seen as different from my parents. And so I tried to assimilate as much as I possibly could. A really common thing that happens with a lot of minorities, I think particularly Asian people, is this question, where are you from? I think it's a super common question, and I've gotten that a lot in my life. One instance was when I was in college. I went to a church. I'd been visiting it for a number of weeks, and we were, greeting people, greeting those around us. It was fine. And there was this woman who was introducing herself, and she asked me, so where are you from? And I'm like, I go to the university just down the road. And she was like, no, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm from Iowa. And she's like, no, where are you from? And I'm like, okay, I'm from South Korea. And she's like, oh, I thought so. And starts talking about how her daughter has adopted a baby from South Korea. And so all of that's great. That's fine. But still, it's showing me that I don't belong. And so I think that's just one small story that happens a lot with a lot of different people, especially people of color. And so these kinds of experiences, they really plagued my mental health. I really struggled with my identity and discerning who am I, who has God called and created me to be. I ran from my ethnic identity, and in doing so, I created defense mechanisms. I started trying to mind read. I started trying to think 5 steps ahead as a way to find the path that leads to the least amount of pain. But running from real or perceived assumptions that others had about me only led to me beginning to allow prejudice and bias start to dwell within me. And so I think it's really important for us to call those things out so that we can be working on those and moving forward. I think sometimes when we think about moving forward, it's really hard to know where to begin because it seems so big, it seems so vast. I think about like 5 action steps that we can take. They're pretty easy, and I hope that it kind of helps give you some kind of guidance in what it looks like to move forward. So the first action step that I thought of was identify ways that we view other people. First and foremost, we are all children of God before anything else. We are citizens of the kingdom of God before anything else. The question is that how we actually view other people? The second step is educate yourself. Education is so important, and it kind of concerns me how little education so many people, especially in America, have when it comes to history. For me personally, I didn't learn about the Japanese internment camps in Hawaii during World War II in school. I learned it through an episode of Hawaii Five-0. And so that's what it was like for me growing up in our educational system. I learned more about the civil rights movement in one lecture in seminary than I did all throughout my public school education. And so there's just a lot of gaps in history that I think we're missing. And so I think for us, it's so important to continue to do education and learning and listening outside beyond any kind of graduation that we may have experienced in our lives. I think it's so important for us to continue to learn. Number 3 is to engage in conversation with others that are different than you. This is so important. And if you are thinking about the people in your life, but you don't really have a safe person where you feel like you can begin an honest conversation with them, a really candid conversation where you can be like, hey, I want to learn, I want to grow, and so in doing so, I'm probably going to say things incorrectly. Is that okay? And if you're in relationship with that person, then they're going to be like, yeah, that's fine. I know you. I know your heart. But if you don't have a person like that in your life, then begin thinking about that. How can you start to begin to have relationship with other people, not for the sake of using them as a resource, but to be in community with one another, to help learn and grow and just make one another better and enrich each other's lives. I think we too often congregate with like-minded folk, and I think this really stunts our growth. The fourth, and this is a really big one, is don't perpetuate tokenism. For me, when I think about tokenism, I think about it being elevating someone because of a trait rather than who they actually are. I think hiring someone because they're a minority is a form of tokenism. Giving other people speaking opportunities because they're a minority is tokenism. Being friends with them, like I said before, to get street cred or something like that is a form of tokenism. In doing so, you are shrinking a person down to a singular trait, but we are created in the image of God. And when we're created in the image of God, we are full and complete people. But tokenism is minimizing us. And so think about chess, right? I am not a chess player, but I know this: the pawns they're pretty dispensable, right? But what happens if we treat others like they're kings and queens, right? What if we loved our neighbors as ourselves? And then the 5th action step that I have for you today is to become more empathetic. We can't know what someone's experience is like, but we can try, we can learn, we can listen. What does it look like for you to turn your heart towards them? This doesn't mean pitying them, but what does it look like to have empathy for them? I think a great way to do this is to get outside of your comfort zone. I have a friend, Michelle Yoshimura Smith. She's awesome, and she, during a talk at Revive, said, had this challenge for them, is to go to a place where you are a minority. Get outside of your comfort zone. I think that's brilliant. That's super easy for us to be able to engage in. And in doing so, when you put yourself into a state of discomfort, you'll quickly find out your biases and your assumptions pretty quickly. So pay attention to that and listen. Listen to other people's stories. Listen to those around you. One of the ways that I have been trying to learn and grow is listening to the women in my life and what their experiences are like. As a man, I have different privileges and a different experience in our world than them. My friend Val, she told me about an experience that she had where she went on a silent retreat. And it was at this big estate. They had like a wall and security guards and stuff, not in like an intimidating way, but in a safe way. And she said that it was like one of the first times in her life where she felt totally at ease. And that just was really fascinating to me. Like I've never really had to consider that very often. But to hear her talk about that experience was really powerful and eye-opening to me. And so I encourage you to find people in your life and listen to their stories. Continue to get outside of your comfort zone. And in doing so, you may not totally understand, but you'll begin to understand and be able to have empathy and care for them. There's a lot of things going on here, right? There's a long ways to go. And when I think about jumbled messes, I think about Christmas lights, right? After all year, you're getting the Christmas lights out, but it's always a tangled mess. And there's no quick fix, at least in my experience, in untangling a ball of Christmas lights. I've tried. But what you got to do is just do it 1 inch at a time, 1 strand at a time until it's all untangled. I think that's how it is in messy situations, and I think talking about racial reconciliation is one of those kinds of topics. After decades of history, in order for us to find a path forward, it has to become untangled, and this happens with time. It's not a quick process. It's not a quick fix. Sometimes it might seem impossible. Sometimes we might just want to quit, because what's the point? But I encourage you, keep going. Don't wait for the next tragedy to hop on the anti-racism train. I think about this quote from one of my favorite authors. His name is Henry Nouwen, and he says, "Compassion can never coexist with judgment because judgment creates the distance, the distinction, which prevents us from really being with the other." I think this is so important. We are called as children of God to help close the gap. We are called to help heal and bring healing to the world around us. And so what does it look like to help close the gap? We are called to be one body, but we can't do that if we're divided.